It's a real pleasure to present to you. And hi, Matheson. Matheson and I did our PhDs together at UNSW in what seems like a different life. So it's nice to see you and thanks for coming. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll start screen sharing. See if this works. Yep, so you can all see my screen. Yep. So this is something I've been thinking through a little bit as I started doing some work on citizens' assemblies. And my work on citizens' assemblies is primarily focused on how we can use citizens' assemblies in Australia to manage constitutional reform processes. And so, you know, there's a whole literature in Australia about how we're constitutionally deadlocked. And there are some arguments that maybe citizens' assemblies would be a way to address some of this. And we've had a recent example of that around the citizens' assemblies in relation to Indigenous peoples that produced the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And so I've been looking at citizens' assemblies, but because my background is also philosophy, I'm really interested in this legitimacy dilemma. So in this paper, I want to explore the so-called legitimacy dilemma as it arises in deliberative theory. And as Francesco noted, it's a very familiar dilemma in deliberative theory, that basically the dilemma is that the higher number of people you have participating in deliberation, the quality is going to suffer, but the outcome of the decision might be more legitimate. If you restrict deliberation, the quality of deliberation might be better, but the outcome might lack legitimacy. Now, mini publics have been proposed as one way out of this dilemma. So according to Robert Gooden and John Dryzek, mini publics present a solution of sorts to the problem of how large groups of individuals could genuinely deliberate together. They're designed to be groups small enough to be genuinely deliberative and representative enough to be genuinely democratic. So mini publics could be defined as small-scale deliberative sites like deliberative polls and citizens' assemblies, in which randomly selected citizens come together to discuss and decide on an issue of public policy or law reform. Now, the question is, do mini publics actually resolve this tension? And there have been a number of arguments in the literature that they don't. So Christina Lafont and John Parkinson, for example, have raised concerns about whether mini publics are genuinely representative. So Lafont's criticisms are targeted at whether they're representative in the sense that she doesn't think stratified random sampling provides an accurate representation of the population. She thinks that the categories that are used for sampling purposes like gender, age, and so on, and ethnicity, aren't going to be relevant for all of the issues that are discussed, and that it doesn't necessarily represent the views of particular people. So she says, just because a woman participates in a citizens' assembly, it doesn't mean that her particular views are representative of all women. But she also thinks that citizens or mini publics are not representative of ordinary citizens, because even if citizens, or firstly, they're not representative of ordinary citizens because they tend to be self-selecting. So people who participate in mini publics tend to be of a particular social class, they tend to be highly educated, they may have atypical levels of interest in political processes and decision-making and so on. But interestingly, she also thinks that they're not representative, because even if a citizen starts the process as an ordinary citizen, so say they have average levels of education, they have no knowledge of the issue being discussed and so on, once they, you know, go through the deliberative filter, as Fishkin calls it, they become expert in that. And so in that sense, they're not like ordinary citizens. And so she says, why would we think that their views are representative of the ordinary citizenry? They're more representative of experts. John Parkinson has a different sort of criticism in relation to legitimacy and representation, and that is that the lines of accountability are not as clear in the case of recommendations that are made by a mini public. So if you have decisions being made by political representatives, that have been elected or democratically elected, then the lines of accountability are clear, and if we don't like the decision, we can vote, the representative out at the next election. Whereas the lines of accountability are less clear in relation to citizens' assemblies. Simone Chambers also has some concerns that if mini publics are perceived as the only places where genuine deliberation can take place, then we've kind of turned our back on the broader democratic sphere as the place to pursue reasonable politics. And she thinks that a lot of the literature in deliberative theory has moved in this direction, that there's been an abandonment of the broader public sphere. Marette Boker also raises concerns about the legitimacy of mini. So she thinks that legitimacy on the deliberative model is also about critical deliberation and contestation, where the legitimacy of authority is always contested and reinstantiated through processes of ongoing discursive challenge and justification. And part of her problem with mini publics is that they tend to be convened from the top down. So they're typically convened by government to address a particular issue. Sometimes they're used as focus groups in relation to an issue. And they're not, she doesn't think they're suitably critical because of these reasons. All right, so how do we deal with this dilemma? So obviously there are many suggestions about how we might overcome the legitimacy dilemma in deliberative theory. So John Dryzek, drawing on a discursive idea of democracy, suggests that we detach the idea of legitimacy from a headcount approach. Because I completely agree with this. I think deliberative theory gets itself into all sorts of knots because of this headcount model of participation. Parkinson, adopting a deliberative systems approach, thinks that we need to think of legitimacy as being created across multiple deliberative moments in the wider deliberative system, and also rethink the concept of legitimacy. Now, I want to say that I agree with both of these recommendations, and I see this paper as a kind of extension of this. So this paper builds on this work in the sense that I think one of the ways out of the legitimacy dilemma is to focus on descriptive accounts of legitimacy. That is, to focus on the ways in which mini publics are perceived by ordinary voters. And part of my impetus for thinking that we need to look at descriptive accounts of legitimacy and the perception of mini publics and focus on this kind of empirical dimension is that I think deliberative theory needs to begin from a standpoint that is more fully informed of current political realities and the ways in which cultural and economic differences and social differences can impact on the processes and outcomes of decision making. Now, I don't want to engage in debates about the distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory, but I'm very sympathetic to Venner's view that if deliberative Democrats want to say something about the legitimating function of actual democracy, then a great deal turns on the extent to which ideals of deliberative democracy are consistent with empirical realities about modern democracies and now, I think the focus of the current debate or the critical debate about the legitimacy of mini publics is on whether they're able to live up to the demands of normative accounts of legitimacy. That is, whether they're suitably representative, inclusive, and critical. Mini publics are found wanting on each of these criteria, and so they don't overcome the legitimacy dilemma. Instead, I want to flip this around. And instead of beginning with the normative account of legitimacy and assessing whether mini publics meet these normative ideals, I want to suggest that we can begin with a descriptive account of legitimacy and work our way backwards to normative legitimacy. So my claim is that there is this distinction between descriptive and normative legitimacy, but that they're connected in really interesting ways. And there's an analogous debate that I draw on that happens in the procedural justice literature around legitimacy that I think is very instructive in this regard. So descriptive legitimacy is concerned with people's perceptions of legitimacy, according to which a set of institutions is legitimate if those who are subject to its directives widely believe that it enjoys the moral right to rule. A prescriptive or a normative conception of legitimacy refers to whether an institution is legitimate if it in fact enjoys the moral right to rule over those it claims the authority to govern. This distinction between descriptive and normative legitimacy has been made in analogous debates about legitimacy in the procedural justice literature. And one of the key findings here is that descriptive legitimacy matters for normative legitimacy because people's perceptions of whether institutions and decisions are legitimate is what confers normative validity in the first place. So legitimacy in the descriptive and normative sense thus converge, I think, in very interesting ways. So in this paper, I want to draw on these arguments together with reference to some empirical evidence about how ordinary voters perceive the legitimacy of mini-publics to argue that this descriptive account of legitimacy has important implications for normative legitimacy in ways that haven't been fully fleshed out. All right, so I should say this paper is quite long and dense, so I'm going to take you through a quick and rough version of it so that we can leave time for questions. So if you look at the G1000 in Belgium and the mini-publics in Ireland on marriage equality and abortion, so taking the G1000 first. So this was a very interesting citizens' assembly because it was a citizen-led one rather than a government-convened one. It was crowd-funded. It was an initial internet stage where all Belgian citizens were invited to submit what they thought of was the main pressing issues confronting Belgium at the time. It was then followed by a town hall meeting of 704 randomly selected people. And then it was followed by the third stage, which was a smaller citizens' assembly of 32 randomly selected people over 3 weekends. As I said, the whole thing was crowdfunded, and the purpose behind it was to kind of address the political deadlock after the election, political deadlock, and bring together the Flemish and the Francophone political parties that had failed to reach an agreement after the election. And the purpose of it was to bring ordinary citizens on both sides of the political divide together to discuss issues facing all of them. Empirical evidence from online surveys carried after the G1000 deliberations, and again 5 years later, found some really interesting, or there were some really interesting findings in relation to legitimacy. The first thing was that the random selection of the G1000 participants did actually represent the general public on several important characteristics, including nationality, age, gender, religion, and region and language. However, predictably, on socioeconomic characteristics for which there were no quotas, the G1000 representation of the general public was not as accurate. So again, there were people who participated tended to come from particular socioeconomic demographics. They were highly educated, had atypical levels of interest in politics and so on. But what was interesting in relation to the empirical findings was that citizens did think that it was really important that power be transferred to them and to citizen bodies rather than the political elites. And that non-participants of the G1000 preferred more deliberative forms of democracy. And this was reproduced 5 years later when there was a follow-up survey. So among the general population, there was widespread support for citizen-led deliberation, and there was strong perception that the recommendations that they made were legitimate. The citizens' assemblies in the Republic of Ireland, I think, provide an interesting counterpoint to the G1000 in the sense that they weren't that they were initiated by government, in relation to constitutional issues in Ireland around marriage equality and abortion. Again, while the Irish Citizens' Assemblies has very mixed views about them, some people think that they were just fabulous, others are very critical of them. I think what comes through in the analysis of what ordinary voters thought is that while initially voters were a bit sceptical about the government convening citizens' assemblies on these issues, because they thought, some voters said in surveys that they thought the government was kicking the can down the road, that the politicians should have just dealt with these issues. Having gone through the process of the Citizens' Assembly, voters had a very different view of it. And they expressed feelings like it was great that these issues were taken out of political hands, as it were, that political elites weren't deciding on these issues, that the debate was much more nuanced because it wasn't pitched in black and white political slogans, that political partisan interests were taken out of the equation, and that the citizens could have a more informed, an informed debate that represented, or more accurately represented, their views. And so people said stuff like, in informal interviews, said stuff like, the Citizens' Assembly meant that the discussion about our abortion laws was led by the people rather than politicians. A Citizens' Assembly is non-partisan, and so it creates a people-led discussion, and so on. Now, while some of this evidence is anecdotal, there's been more rigorous empirical studies by Jacobs and Kaufman, for example, that find that a decision-making process that includes a deliberative mini-public is considered to be more legitimate than a decision-making process that doesn't. And other studies by Gastill found that the information provided to the general public by a mini-public, in this case, the Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon in the US, was found to be more informative and more simply expressed than that provided by the state. And again, my good colleague Ron Levy, in his empirical study of the constitutional deadlock in Australia, found that ordinary citizens trusted a People's Assembly more than they trusted the parliamentary model, and that while they thought Parliament would be better informed, they trusted the People's Assembly to be fairer and to better represent the interests of the voting public. While a Citizens' Assembly isn't necessarily going to break the constitutional deadlock in Australia, because I think that exists for all sorts of complicated reasons, the recommendations that are made by these bodies would be perceived by voters as more legitimate than those made by political elites. So Levy concludes that Australians, and that there seems to be a hardening resistance to trusting any authority other than a citizen-led one. So I think the empirical evidence suggests that there is a strong perception by ordinary voters that that these sorts of bodies are in fact legitimate. So how does this descriptive account of legitimacy then, how does this descriptive account of legitimacy then get us out of the legitimacy dilemma? Now, the literature on procedural justice and social psychology has produced an enormous amount of empirical research demonstrating the importance of citizens' perceptions in relation to what makes the use of power legitimate and what makes citizens comply with legal norms and trust legal authorities. Interestingly, this literature has shown that people care as much, if not more, about how authorities exercise power and make decisions than they do about the actual decisions that are made. And there are four main factors that are relevant to people in their dealings with authorities. The first is people really care about having an opportunity to explain their situation or tell their side of the story in a conflict. People really care about neutrality in the sense that they expect decisions to be made consistently in reference to legal principles and the facts of the case. People really care about transparency of processes. And finally, people really care about being treated with dignity, politeness, and respect. Now, the social psychology literature is concerned about people's perceptions of legitimacy. and in this respect, it operates with a descriptive or a sociological conception of legitimacy, according to which an institution is legitimate if those subject to its directives think that it enjoys a moral right to rule. Now, this sociological conception of legitimacy is different to a prescriptive or normative conception, according to which an institution is legitimate if it in fact has a moral right to rule. One implication of the empirical findings in the procedural justice literature is that citizens are more likely to confer legitimacy on legal officials if they think those officials are behaving in line with citizens' normative expectations. Conversely, if legal authorities want to be seen as legitimate, and if they want to achieve cooperation and compliance, they should ensure that their processes are consistent with people's normative expectations. Now, the salient feature of this interplay between descriptive and normative accounts of legitimacy for my purposes is that while the two senses of legitimacy are different, they are interdependent. The perceived legitimacy of institutions and legal authorities in descriptive sense confers legitimacy in a normative sense. That is among, or indeed is exhaustive of, legitimacy in the normative sense. Without the widespread perception that institutions and legal officials are legitimate, so legitimacy in the descriptive sense, legitimacy in the normative sense is compromised because institutions and authorities would no longer be able to rely on citizens internalising legal rules and cooperating with them to solve social coordination problems that might come up. Instead, institutions and legal authorities would have to rely on deterrence approaches to secure compliance, approaches which have been found to weaken actual legitimacy over the long term and which are not as effective. So, how does this then get us out of the legitimacy dilemma? So, I think normative legitimacy, as articulated by deliberative theory, remains as relevant as ever. But this means that many public organisers should embed representation, inclusivity, and critical engagement with authority in the design of mini-publics. But they should do so for normative reasons, because it's morally right that citizens have a say in how they're governed and that they ought to participate in the legal norms that will ultimately bind them. But these features should also be included in the design of mini-publics for descriptive reasons, because handing over power to a citizen body to make recommendations increases the perceived legitimacy of the process by the voting public and thus increases the legitimacy of the outcome. Now, with this distinction between normative and descriptive legitimacy in mind and how they converge, I think it's useful to return to some of the criticisms that are made by Lafont and Parkinson in relation to accountability. Now, in relation to representation, while it is true that random statistical sampling is not going to be able to represent the views of every affected person, it does capture a diversity of individual opinions, values, and perspectives in the public sphere. Going back to the empirical evidence, at the descriptive level, it doesn't seem as relevant, or citizens don't seem to care as much about whether they personally had a say about an issue that affects them, but whether a diversity of views was represented and whether their view was in fact represented, and whether the decisions were made using this discursive process and on the basis of good reasons, rather than in relation to partisan political commitments. If these descriptive conditions are met, then it may be that the recommendations are in fact deemed legitimate. Moreover, and again, this is kind of contra Lafont, while many public participants might be better informed about a particular issue more so than ordinary voters, I don't think it's correct to call them experts after a few weekends of deliberation and education about an issue. And importantly, they're actually not perceived as experts by ordinary citizens. Participants are in fact no different from other voters who might choose to be better informed about an issue and deliberate with their colleagues, family, and friends. The empirical evidence suggests that ordinary voters recognise participants as fellow citizens rather than experts or political elites, and as a consequence tend to trust their judgments more. Despite the fact that, as Levy has shown, the perception is that they're not as better informed as political elites. Moreover, I think that to suggest that all ordinary voters are uninformed and cannot deliberate is to underestimate the capacities of ordinary voters and to overestimate the expert capacities of many public participants. In relation to the problem of accountability, I think the recommendations that are made by many publics are not perceived at the descriptive level to constitute ruling as such, nor are the recommendations perceived as lawmaking. They're simply recommendations that are made on the basis of more information and better deliberation. These recommendations then typically taken to the voting public, who must engage with further deliberation and so on. So given these features, I don't think we necessarily have to decide between mini publics and widespread participation as if these options were mutually exclusive. Instead, as the G1000 and the Irish Citizens' Assemblies demonstrated, these forums or these sites of deliberation constituted part of a much wider deliberative system, to use Parkinson and Mansbridge's term. And what they suggest is that they're actually part of a very complex network of deliberations that occur not only from the bottom up or the top down, but occur horizontally across all aspects of the civil society and the broader public sphere. So I think these descriptive features about how many publics operate and how they're perceived by the voting public has implications for legitimacy in the normative sense. Okay, so at the normative level, the assumption is also, and I'll conclude with this, that legitimacy is best achieved by way of representative democracy because the lines of accountability are clear, as are the channels of communication, both within civil society and between civil society. However, as representative democracy from the perspective of legitimacy. And one of the most fundamental problems is that while elected representatives might be accountable, they all also have vested partisan interests. And in this respect, there are some issues that they simply should not be left to determine on their own. And there are all sorts of examples of this. We have independent bodies deciding on all sorts of issues because it's best that an independent body does it rather than an elected representative. And so deciding on electoral boundaries, for example, or certain financial things like setting the official interest rate, all of these are addressed by independent bodies rather than partisan interests. All right, I'll just conclude now because I'd like to leave time for question time. So basically, I think the legitimacy dilemma is partially generated by a normative demand for widespread participation by all those affected in any decision-making process. Because of this demanding ideal, many publics have been rejected by some deliberative Democrats as producing illegitimate recommendations or decisions. I suggest that one potential way out of the dilemma is to examine the empirical realities about how many publics function in political decision-making, and in particularly to focus on how they're perceived by ordinary voters. Using analogous debates from the procedural justice literature about how descriptive and normative legitimacy converge, I've argued that the empirical evidence reveals that many publics are perceived as legitimate by ordinary voters. And perhaps this perception is good enough to get us to legitimacy in the normative sense. And I'll end there.